again, and welcome to Reading Together, as we are reading through Heaven Taken by Storm by Thomas Watson. And so last week, we officially came to the end of Watson's section on how we are to offer violence to ourselves. And so now in the two chapters that we are going to be discussing this week, chapters 10 and chapter 10 and chapter 11, we'll be discussing how the Christian is supposed to offer violence to Satan and to the world. And so this kind of he'll go on and have one more chapter to discuss how we will offer violence to heaven. But with these two chapters, it kind of rounds out the kind of three-part enemies of us in our Christian walk that we typically think of, right? That we think of of Satan, our own sin, and the world, right? And I think that Watson gives an appropriate length of time here in his book to those things. That he spends several chapters discussing how we're to do violence against ourselves, how we're to fight against our own sinful nature and the corruptness within our own hearts. And now he's getting into discussing Satan, and he gives just a couple of pages on Satan, but certainly treats the topic seriously and gives only a couple of pages on the world, right? And I think that our own sin is indeed the more important of the three. That the only power that Satan has, the only corruption that the world can offer to us, is actually getting us to sin, which is what Watson will present to us today. And so I think it is right that he spends so much time discussing how we are to offer violence against ourselves. And now he's getting into, with these two chapters, the two of the main means by which temptation comes to us from outside us, right? So Satan will tempt us into sin, and the world will threaten to lead us into sin as well. And so let's begin with chapter 10, the Christian offering violence to Satan. And so just a quick outline of this chapter. So he begins very quickly by discussing what exactly is Satan's opposition to us. And he begins by saying that Satan opposes us both by open violence and secret treachery. And so by his open violence, he is called the red dragon, and by his secret treachery, he is called the old serpent, right? And so then he briefly discusses Satan's violence, and then gives a more extended look at Satan's treachery, giving 6 examples of Satan's treachery towards us, the subtlety of that ancient serpent. And then he finally ends the chapter by showing how we are to offer violence against Satan. And he gives us 2 means of doing that, by faith and by prayer. And so that's the overall outline of the chapter. As I said, a pretty short chapter. And so let me give you just walk back through it and give it just a couple of examples of some of the places that I very much enjoyed. So he doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about Satan's violence, but we should note that Satan is indeed violent towards us, right? I love what Watson says, that Satan labors to storm the castle of the heart. He stirs up passion, lust, and revenge. These are called fiery darts in Ephesians 6:16, because they often set the soul on fire, right? And so Satan, in regards to his fierceness, is called a lion. Your adversary, the devil, is a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. And then he notes that Chrysostom says, note that whom he may bite, but whom he may devour. And so he doesn't spend a whole lot of time on that, because I think that that hopefully we should know that Satan is actively and openly opposed to us, right? That his desire is to get us this in, and so I think he rightfully spends more time talking about Satan's treachery, because Satan's treachery is no less violent, but it is a treacherous violence, right? We can all think. We can all see pretty clearly how Satan would stir up our own passions and our own lusts in order to get us to sin. But treachery, by its very nature, is subtle, and so I think it is good that he spends time talking about this. And so he introduces Satan's treachery with this powerful line: what Satan cannot do by force, he will endeavor to do by fraud, right? If he can't come at it directly, he will make sure that he does it indirectly. And so Watson gives us 6 examples of Satan's treachery, of how he might lead us astray. And so the first one, he says that he'll suit his temptations to the temper of the individual. So in other words, however that is best going to fit the person. And we know, of course, that Satan is not omniscient as God is omniscient. He doesn't know everything. And so how is he able to tailor fit the temptations to us? Well, Watson says that Satan is a studier of our facial features and expressions, and so he is watching us, and he lays suitable baits based on the inclinations that he sees in us, right? And so the second thing that he tells us of Satan's treachery is that he'll draw men to evil under the pretense of good. And maybe this is one of the most important things for us to hear, right? Is that so often that is how evil can come about, is that, well, it's necessary evil, right? To quote Bane from The Dark Knight Rises. And Watson says that Satan entices some men to sinful actions and persuades them much good will come of it. He tells them in some cases that they may dispense with the rule of the word and stretch their conscience beyond that line, so that they may be in a capacity of doing more service. And notice this last part: as if God needed our sin to raise his glory. Man, doesn't that just cut through it, right? Sin is never okay. There never is such thing as a necessary evil. God doesn't need our sin to raise his glory. He doesn't need us committing evil in order to do some greater good, or greater good as we see fit, right? And so that's one of Satan's strategies for us. The next thing he says is he attempts to sin gradually, right, in degrees, right? And he gives the example of Eve and how God came came to Eve and didn't just immediately tell her to eat the apple, but instead he came to her with the question of, did God really say, right? The fourth thing that he gives to us is that he tempts us to evil in lawful things, right? So things that may not otherwise be sinful, but he tempts us to use them in a sinful way. And so one of the examples he gives is it was lawful for Noah to eat the fruit of the grape, but he took too much and so sinned, right? He got drunk off of the wine. And so then he notes this: excess turns that which is good into evil. Eating and drinking may turn to intemperance. Industry in one's calling, when excessive, is covetousness, right? And so that, I think, is especially a word for us today, right? So many sins, I believe, start out that way, is that they're not things that are inherently sinful themselves, but instead they're good gifts that God has given to us, like food and drink and sex, that we use however we see fit. We don't use them in the bounds that God has given to them. And so we take good gifts that God has given to us and we use them in an evil way, right? The fifth thing that he says is that he puts men upon doing good out of evil, or to do good out of evil motives. So he says, if he cannot hurt them by scandalous actions, he will by virtuous actions. Well, how is that going to happen, right? How is he going to do that? Well, he causes us to do religious actions, to do them for poor motives, right? And so he goes on to say at the end of that paragraph, to talk about the hypocrisy of us doing religious actions out of impure motives. And he says, this hypocrisy leavens the duties of religion and makes them lose the reward. And of course, Jesus warned us against that very thing in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 6, where he gives us a brief discourse on three acts of religion, on fasting, on praying, and on giving, right? And in all three of those things, what does Jesus focus on? Of Don't fast to be seen by others. Don't pray to be heard by others and seen by others. And don't give so that people know how generous you are, right? And so Satan comes along, and if he can't get us to do those overtly sinful actions, that's what he'll get us to do. He'll get us to do good religious actions, right? God-pleasing actions, but he'll get us to do them in a hypocritical way that is itself evil, right? And then 6, he persuades men to evil by such as are good. And so he goes on and he says, this sets a gloss upon his temptations and makes them less suspect. The devil has made use sometimes of the most eminent and holy men to promote his temptations. The devil tempted Christ by an apostle, right? So he may use people who we deem are good, the people that we trust and respect, right? And use them to lead us, right? And he gives 2 examples in Scripture of Peter, trying to persuade, to dissuade Christ from going to the cross, of pulling Jesus aside and rebuking him, and Jesus and Jesus telling him, "Get behind me, Satan." Or Abraham, right? Who was the man of faith, right? We are all children of Abraham by faith, and he told his wife to say that you are my sister, right? And so we're all sinners. Christ is the only sinless person who has ever walked this planet, and so we must be aware of that too. That that Satan may use otherwise godly people in moments in order to get us to sin. And so those are the 6 ways of Satan's treachery that Watson lays out for us, by no means exhaustive. And then he tells us how we might resist Satan's subtleties in tempting. And he says, first of all, we must resist him by faith. And he says that faith is a wise and an intelligent grace. It can see the hook under the bait. It is a heroic grace. It is said, above all, to quench the fiery darts of Satan. Faith resists the devil. And of course, he's quoting from Ephesians 6, which we're studying on Sunday mornings, the shield of faith that quenches the fiery darts of Satan. And then returning back to the castle of the heart metaphor that he used at the beginning of the chapter, he says, faith keeps the castle of the heart, that it does not yield. It is not being tempted that makes a man guilty, but giving consent. I know that that's one thing that I've especially wrestled with when I was a younger Christian, and I think that we need to be reminded of frequently, right? That temptation itself is not sin. The thought, the being tempted to sin is not the act of sin. It is yielding into temptation, right? And so we will have thoughts of sin. We will have thoughts that are that come into our minds that are leading us to sin. But where the sin either comes or goes is what we do with that, right? And so I think that is a very, very wise word from Watson. It's not being tempted that makes a man guilty, but giving consent, right? And he says faith enters its protest against Satan. But then he goes on one step further and he says, so not only does faith not yield to temptation, it also beats back the temptation. And he says that faith holds the promise in one hand and Christ in the other. The promise encourages faith and Christ strengthens it so that faith beats the enemy out of the field, right? So we cling to what God has said. We cling to that God is the superior joy. He is the superior treasure, and we will and sin loses its grip. It loses the lie slowly but surely as we cling to Christ in faith, right? And then last of all, so we offer violence against Satan by faith, but then second, we offer violence to him by prayer. And so as we are studying the armor of God, it is, I love that Watson puts in here a sample prayer. That he says, in all temptations, go to God in prayer. And then he gives a sample prayer. And he says, Lord, teach me to use every piece of the spiritual armor, how to hold the shield, how to wear the helmet, how to use the sword of the Spirit. Lord, strengthen me in the battle. Let me rather die a conqueror than be taken prisoner and led by Satan in triumph, right? And so the last paragraph, he gives us just a summary statement of all of this, and lets us and encourages us with this word, that the enemy has already in part been defeated. Christ, who is the captain of our salvation, has given Satan his death wound upon the cross. The serpent is soonest killed in his head. Christ has bruised the head of the old serpent. The devil is a chained enemy and a conquered enemy. Therefore, fear not to give him battle. Resist him and he will fly. He knows no other march than running away, right? And so that's not to say that we underestimate Satan, right? You spent the whole chapter talking about why we should not underestimate Satan and the treachery and the violence of Satan, right? But I love that he ends on that note, because that is absolutely so true. We are fighting a defeated foe. And so that's why James tells us that we should submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee, right? We're not called to go on the attack. We're not called to go on the offense. Satan will come to attack us plenty. We don't need to go looking for him. He'll come looking for us. Our job is to resist. Chapter 11. He talks about offering violence to the world, and this is a very short chapter. I think if he was writing today, he would probably spend more time on it than he did, but maybe not. But so he begins with a couple of paragraphs just explaining to us the danger of the world. He calls the world a golden apple, right? And he says that, and one of the things that I love is at the end of that first paragraph is that he says it is hard to climb up the hill of God with too many golden weights, right? And that is exactly what the world is it's golden weights. We think that it has all of these precious things, but all they do is they weigh us down. They don't necessarily all the time keep us from climbing up, but they are hindering our ability to climb. And he goes on and says, those who are deprived of the honors of the world also lack the temptations of it, right? And that is a very hidden blessing, oftentimes, as that those who may not have honor in the world for now also lack the temptations that come with the honors of the world. And then he says that the world, one of the dangers of the world is that it is a flattering enemy, right? And he says that it shows its two breasts, pleasure and profit, right? And it would, and it seeks to put both of its breasts in our mouths. And he says the world never kisses us except with an intent to betray us. And so the pleasure and the profit of the world, they are against us, right? They seem to be for us in the initial, but they ultimately lead to death, right? And so he goes on and he says that too many are wedded to their money as one of the chief examples of the world's pleasure and the world's profit. Too many are wedded to their money. They live together as man and wife. Oh, let us take heed of being entangled in this pleasing snare, right? And then he says that sin is not in using the world, but in loving it, right? We are in the world, as he goes on to say. If we are Christians, we must offer violence to the world. Believers are called out of the world, yet they are in the world, right? And so it's not sin to use the world, because we're here. We're bodily people, right? And we will be bodily people after the resurrection. We'll have sinless bodies, right? But we will still be in the body, in our new bodies. And so it's not sin to use the world, but it is sin to love the world, right? And so we are called out of the world. And so let us not be a people that are of the world, even while we must by necessity be in the world. And then he goes on and he says that we say of a dying man, he is not a man for this world. And he goes on, a true saint is crucified in his affections to the world. He is dead to its honors and pleasures. What delight does a dead man take in pictures or music? And maybe that is a question for each of us to ask ourselves too, is that are we dead to the pleasures of the world? Have we really died to to the beauties that the world thinks that it's presenting to us, what it thinks are beauties, to its music, to its pictures, to its movies, to its stories that it's trying to tell us, to its riches and its goods. Are we dead to those things? Right? Do they have no claim on us, or are we going with them just as much as the rest of the world? And he ends that paragraph with this, probably my favorite line of the chapter. He says, "Living fish swim against the stream. We must swim against the world. Else we shall be carried down the stream and fall into the sea of the dead." So, is that what we are doing? Are we swimming against the world, which would be a sign of life, or are we going with the stream to be a sign of death? And he ends with 3 kind of really quick points of why we must offer violence against the world. He says that it is deceitful, it is defiling, and it is perishing. Right? And he gives the for it's deceitful, gives the analogy of it. It promises us Rachel, but it puts us off with bleary-eyed Leah. It promises to satisfy our desires, and it only increases them. It gives poison pills, but it wraps them in sugar. Right? So its promises can't be taken. We can't hold to its promises. They're not secure. There's no stability in them. They're deceitful, and they are defiling. Right? As he notes. That it first spots the men's consciences, and then its names. It is called filthy lucre because it makes men so filthy. And then finally, maybe for me, the most meaningful of the 3, it's deceitful, defiling, but it's also perishing. The world is like a flower which withers while we are smelling it. So in the moment that we are smelling and enjoying the world, it's already fading away. It's already perishing. It's already gone. And so are we offering violence to the world? Are we offering violence against Satan, our enemy? If we would desire to follow Christ, the world was against Christ. As we see in the crucifixion. That they were willing to crucify the Son of God that came into the world. And Satan, of course, has been opposed to Christ from the beginning. And so if we would follow after his likeness, we must also be prepared each day to give violence against Satan and against the world, both of which are deceitful. And so I pray that we would do so. And I'll see you next week as we discuss offering violence against heaven. Grace and peace.